The real reason Barry won't have a day in court is because the idea of freedom of speech on that subject is a threat to them. And the idea of public scrutiny, which a trial on Barry's claim would generate, is a real threat to these people who want to suppress any possibility of debate, who want to punish Barry for speaking out, and who want to stifle anyone else's inclination to speak out.
SOGI 123 may help a very, very small percentage of gender dysphoric children, but it has the effect of confusing a lot more who have special needs children who have difficult issues they're dealing with. And now they've got the idea that all you have to do to solve your problems is start taking puberty blockers and hormones, and all your problems will go away. That is a devastating message to give to our children in school.
Barry Neufeld, a former school trustee in the Chilliwack, BC area, who received much backlash after speaking out on behalf of parents who had concerns about gender ideology in schools, as well as BC's sexual orientation curriculum, has just been told by the Supreme Court that he will not have his case heard in court. Beside me is his lawyer, Paul Jaffe, and we're going to hear from Barry himself soon as well in this report. But first, if you appreciate that unlike the state-backed media, Rebel News brings you the other side of the story, including what you're about to hear in this report, then you can help support our journalism, which is completely independent from the Trudeau government, by doing some shopping for Canada Day. Go to rebelnewsstore.com, check out our new Canada Day line, and use coupon code DREA10 when you do. We appreciate your support.
I am a barrister, so I do court work, and over the last decade or so, I've had a special focus on constitutional issues. Freedom of speech, thought, opinion, belief, religion, peaceful assembly, those kinds of issues really interest me. And in the fall of 2017, when Barry, who was a trustee on the Chilliwack School Board, first spoke out about SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identification program that was had been implemented in the schools already by that point. Barry expressed the view that this was of great concern to himself and many of the parents who elected him to be their voice on the school board. So Barry, anticipating that he would pay a personal price for speaking out on this sort of ideological sacred cow of sorts, it wasn't to be questioned or challenged in any way. So Barry did anticipate some backlash. And sure enough, from the moment he first spoke out, throughout the next year, he was vilified in the media in a number of very egregious ways. Eventually got to the point where he felt he had to fight back. So in the fall of 2018, a defamation claim was filed in the BC Supreme Court, specifically pleading 11 separate publications, both through the print media and through broadcast media, targeting Glenn Hansman, who was the president of the BCTF at the time. He was just one of many prominent people who had embarked upon this, what we call a smear campaign, trying to destroy Mr. Neufeld, and also to deter anybody else who may be inclined to speak out on this thing. In addition, of course, the unions, both CUPE and the BCTF, instigated human rights tribunal proceedings against Barry. So he's fighting against the government through their very own BC human rights tribunals, which of course is an oxymoron, honestly.
Why is Barry's case for defamation not going to be heard?
Well, the real reason it's not going to be heard is that the people who are running governments and public sector unions and who are participating in a hugely funded group of public interest groups pushing along the SOGI business. The real reason Barry won't have a day in court is because the idea of freedom of speech on that subject is a threat to them. And the idea of public scrutiny, which a trial on Barry's claim would generate, is a real threat to these people who want to suppress any possibility of debate, who want to punish Barry for speaking out, and who want to stifle anyone else's inclination to speak out. That's the real reason Barry's not getting a day in court. The stated reason by the Supreme Court of Canada, if you can believe it, is that Barry theoretically constitutes some sort of threat to Mr. Hansman's freedom of speech. Mr. Hansman, president of the BCTF, the other public sector unions joining him in the effort to both vilify Neufeld and to prevent Neufeld from having a day in court. So you've got the public sector unions, you've got governments, you've got all of these special interest groups, these activists, against a sole voice of Barry Neufeld on the Chilliwack School Board, and this laughable pretext that Barry somehow constitutes a threat to the freedom of speech of Mr. Hansman. But if you can believe it, that's what took place in Ottawa last week, and that was the basis of the ruling last week. The other basis of the ruling was Glenn Hansman's own identity. The court noted that he is a gay person, and as though that could possibly ever matter in a court system governed by the rule of law, the sexual orientation of a party has now become a factor. And in my view, this is horrifying. It is repugnant to everything I've ever understood about a functional and judicious legal system. But it has now become a relevant factor. The gender or the sexual orientation of the defendant was a factor in this case. Hansman, without a scintilla of evidence, simply the claim of Hansman that he was speaking on behalf of marginalized or vulnerable people in the LGBTQ, whatever that group is called these days, the mere assertion of that fantasy was enough to oust Neufeld from a day in court without a scintilla of evidence other than the representations of a whole slew of publicly funded public interest groups that the Supreme Court of Canada invited to intervene and help out Mr. Hansman. So it was basically 11 parties speaking at the Supreme Court of Canada, all publicly funded, against Barry Neufeld. And we've seen what happens now. I should tell you that the BC Court of Appeal was very clear that we should not involve ourselves in a debate on the merits of the underlying gender ideology issues, and that at this point, under the SLAPP law, it's simply whether Barry has a meritorious claim and whether there's a prospect that a defense raised by Hansman won't prevail. The Supreme Court of Canada judgment last week did include what's called a dissent opinion of Madam Justice Cote, who applied principles, in my view, judiciously. It, unlike the majority judgment, was not a result-oriented, selective choice of various facts and the on-off application of principles depending on whose side the court is taking. Madam Justice Cote's ruling was coherent and judicious and reflected the impartiality that we expect of our courts. The majority ruling was, in my view, quite shocking.
Now, of course, we see anytime someone does raise issues about gender ideology or SOGI 123 in schools, many times parents themselves included are being called hateful, transphobic. There was a little bit of that inside of this ruling as well. What was said in that area?
Well, it looked like the judge who wrote the majority opinion was essentially arguing on behalf of Hansman and the other activists on this idea that indoctrinating these kids with gender fluidity and other such things is a good idea and ought to be permitted, and people who get in the way of that ought not to be given access to the courts, regardless of the merits of their claim. It seemed to be just essentially siding with Mr. Hansman's side of the underlying debate, and courts should never be doing that, but they're doing it now. And in my view, that's absolutely repugnant to the rule of law.
And of course, articles like the one you're seeing here from state-backed media, CBC, is sort of celebrating it in the sense saying that the ruling was that Mr. Neufeld was hateful. We're going to throw to him right now and just quickly get an update from him on how he's feeling with things like that.
I guess I wasn't totally surprised. The only good thing I can say is that they made a clear ruling. I was worried that they might make some mealy-mouthed ruling that didn't make any sense. But they have come down clearly on the side of the party that's been bullying me for all these years, and they're in cahoots with them. Santa's little helpers in their red suits are clearly standing and watching a loyal public servant get bullied by a big union. I could lose my home because they could order Glenn Hansman to pay costs, but I will argue that his legal case was completely bankrolled by the BC Teachers Union, and he's not out of pocket any money. but I'm out of pocket a lot, and my loyal supporters have stuck with me. And I still think that I did the right thing. I reject their accusation that I'm against transgender kids. I'm not against any individuals. I'm against a program that is being used in schools that I believe is doing more harm than good.
Barry, when you first started speaking out about SOGI 123 and gender ideology, there were a lot of parents who didn't even know what those things are. Now we see protests against these very issues in British Columbia and across the country. What does that feel like to you to see that happening?
You know, it feels wonderful. And yet it's almost as if I can step back and let others take up the battle. But I was right at the forefront. You know, it's funny, back in 2017, my son was getting quite enamored with Jordan Peterson, and he was even donating money to Jordan. I thought, oh, who is this guy? What's so great about Jordan Peterson? Well, he's speaking out against compelled speech, use of personal pronouns. I thought, oh, that is so weird. That will never be an issue in Chilliwack. And of course, later in the year, I discovered that it was a big issue, and this has been brewing universities for quite a few years. But I was surprised that nobody stuck up for me. I seemed to be a lone voice for at least a couple of years, but now there are numerous organizations that are taking up the cause, and there's changes happening around the world. They're turning around in Finland, Sweden, England. Several American states are pushing against it, and it feels like I may have come out against something before anybody was aware of it. And there are still people out there that can't believe this is actually being taught in kindergarten and primary school and confusing children. SOGI 123 may help a very, very small percentage of gender dysphoric children, but it has the effect of confusing a lot more who have special needs children who have difficult issues they're dealing with. And now they've got the idea that all you have to do to solve your problems is start taking puberty blockers and hormones, and all your problems will go away. That is a devastating message to give to our children in school.
So, Mr. Neufeld and yourself, you went to the highest of courts, all the way to Ottawa. Is this it for this situation? Can anything else be done?
Well, other than the remote possibility that the court may look at a reopening application, which rarely actually ever is successful, this is the end of this case, yes. And but the impact of this case is going to transcend into other areas, and any efforts to publicly debate such hot button issues as vaccine mandates, gender ideology, the critical race theory, the Aboriginal narratives being promoted by governments, any capacity for society to accommodate a civil debate is compromised, in my view, when the Supreme Court of Canada tell judges that they should involve themselves in these underlying debates in order to decide who has access to the courts. This is a horrifying prospect, and I'm quite concerned about where we're headed.
And that's why we're going to have a follow-up report that focuses on the anti-SLAPP legislation that really you feel is the core of the issue, where you say it's going to bleed into other cases to come on those. So don't miss that. If you go to rebelnews.com, there's an option to give us your email so we can send that out to you as well. Paul Jaffe from the Greater Vancouver area, Andrea Humphrey with Rebel News. If you appreciated this report, as well as the other reports that Rebel News brings you, consider supporting our journalism, which is independent from government interests, in a really cool way. If you go to rebelnewsstore.com, you can check out our new merchandise for the summer, like this t-shirt here, my personal favorite, the Trudeau Castro. And you can even save by using my coupon, DREA10, when you do. We appreciate your support.